So today we're going to talk about some different market failures. We've already talked about some market failures, and I talked a little bit about how to fix them. One of those, of course, was monopoly. Monopoly is considered a market failure because output is below the societal optimum, which would occur at the competitive output. And to fix that particular market failure, we talked very briefly about antitrust laws and other regulations that can be applied to monopoly. I think we also talked a little bit about the commons problem, and that's a market failure because the commons tends to get overused and so it's not used optimally. We talked about regulating usage, we talked about social approbation, creating markets as a potential solution to that market failure. But one of the things we didn't talk all that much about is implementing property rights to deal with market failures. And so that's what I want to talk about today in two contexts. One context is the context of what is the difference between a public and a private good. So for example, we could ask why it might be better for government to provide public goods as opposed to the private sector. The private sector should be really good at providing most things, especially if somebody really wants it and somebody values the product. But in the context of a pure public good, it may be impossible for the private sector to produce that thing and cover their costs. So why is it better for government to provide public goods than a private firm? That's, I think, a reasonable question. We could also ask the question, and very much a corollary to the first one, is why is it better for for the public sector to provide an army or a police force than the private sector? It's not that the private sector can't do this. We see private security forces all over the place. But for a nationwide security force, it's probably better that the public sector or the government provides that particular item or that particular service. So the solution to those problems, the solutions to those questions, or the answers to those questions, comes by asking about property rights, and particularly about the difference between private and public goods. First of all, I want to talk a little bit more about property rights. Property rights are really important institutions in a market economy. Markets are based upon individuals owning property. And that property can take a number of different forms. One is the goods and services, or the goods and skills, I should say, of the resources. And those resources can trade those skills and those services and those goods that people actually possess. If property rights are not well defined, however, or if they're not enforced, then there's a limited incentive to actually protect that property or provide the skills that might benefit other people. And that lack of incentive is what underpins or undergirds the market failure. So because there's not an incentive to provide the goods, the skills, the resources, the things that are part of what would normally be considered private property, then the market doesn't provide those things. There's not an optimal quantity of those goods provided. And also the price is probably suboptimal as well. So what do we mean by property rights? Well, we mean different things by property rights. Of course, there's physical property, so the ownership of a house or a car or a phone, but also intellectual property. Intellectual property are the non-physical properties that people possess or create. So it could be an idea, it could be an invention, it could be the blueprints to something, it could be music, it could be a story. It's some kind of creative work that is a result of somebody's intellect. So it's not a physical, tangible thing, it's something that is more ethereal. These things get protected in democratic societies through the implementation of property rights and trademarks, through copyrights and trademarks and patents. So we do try to protect intellectual property. That's becoming more and more of a concern in the information-based economy. Without those incentives and without those protections that come through the legal system, there's little motivation for people to bring those ideas, those creative works, those just those interesting things that people have created through their intellect, there's very little incentive to bring those things to market. So we wouldn't have as much software created. We wouldn't have as many music selections. We wouldn't have as many literature selections. We wouldn't have as many great ideas. We probably wouldn't have as many pharmaceutical products or other kinds of innovations, technological innovations that come to market if we weren't able to protect the property of the person who brought it to market in the first place. In other words, if someone could just steal your intellectual property, there's no reason for you to reveal that intellectual property in the first place. When we talk about property rights, we're talking specifically here about private property. And that private property provides the exclusive right, or the private property protections provide the exclusive rights of ownership that allow for the use of and the exchange of property. We've just assumed up until this point, for the most part in our class, that people can exchange goods and services. And they can, but the goods and services don't have to be privately owned. They can be owned by somebody else. You could steal somebody's stuff and then sell it on the market. But again, that creates a huge incentive problem. Here we are talking very clearly and very specifically about private property. The private property protections then have spillover effects. They have extra benefits because it creates incentives to maintain property and conserve property, as well as to listen to the incentives and the wishes of others. Because if somebody wants what you have and you haven't taken care of it, they're not going to pay you as much. But if you know you can go out into the market and sell your property, as long as it's well protected and well kept up, you have an incentive now to use that property efficiently and to conserve it. Private property incentives involve a number of things. Now, this is a picture of a Toyota Tacoma truck. I have a truck very similar to this. It's not this particular truck. This one looks in a little bit better shape than the one I have. But because it is my property, I have a huge incentive to maintain it. So I take it to a mechanic every so often to, tune it up to make sure it's running well. I put it in the barn in the wintertime because I don't want it to sit out in the snow, although it's sitting out in the snow now. But nevertheless, I try to take care of it in the wintertime. I try to keep it safe and hopefully it's going to be reliable, and it has been very reliable. I have an incentive to protect it. So I lock the doors in the car because it's mine. I don't want someone to steal it. I have an incentive to conserve this vehicle, to extend the life. So I don't drive it as much as I could. When I do drive it, I'm very careful with it. It's an older truck, so I'm not taking it, off-roading because, well, it's pretty old, and I'm not sure how well would hold up on off-road conditions. And when I drive it on the roads, I don't rev the engine up. I try to conserve it. And that's because it's my property and I want it to last. And of course, I also have an incentive to take care of it and to maintain it and to protect it, because if somebody wants this vehicle and offers me enough money for it, then I have the incentive to trade. But people aren't going to offer me as much money if the truck's all beat up. So I have an incentive to protect it because of the opportunity that I have to potentially trade it down the road. Okay, so private property is clearly important here. But not all goods are private, and not all goods can be private. So let's take a look here at what private goods look like, or what are the characteristics of private goods. Some goods have certain characteristics associated with them. For example, some goods are excludable. You can keep people from using a good if they don't pay for it. The good's got to be purchased before it can be used. And we see this with a lot of the stuff that we buy, whether it's clothing, like a pair of pants, whether it's a sandwich at a restaurant, whether it is a music that you download off the internet. You've got to pay for it first, and if you don't pay, you can be excluded from using it. But private goods are also rival in consumption. That means that the good cannot be used by more than one person at the same time. That's what a rival good means. It's a good that cannot be enjoyed by more than one person at the same time. Again, think about a pair of pants. If you put the pants on, nobody else can use them. So you've paid for them, and if you didn't, you wouldn't be able to use them. They're excludable, and they're rival, so when you wear them, nobody else can. That's an example of a private good. It has both of these characteristics. Private goods are both excludable and rival in consumption. And again, most of the goods that we buy are private goods. Gasoline that we put in our car, all the food that we buy, all the clothes that we buy, your iPods and your iPhones and your iPads and your iMacs and all of the books that you buy. Maybe two people can read it at the same time, but it's going to be really hard. It's not going to be really that convenient if two people are trying to read the same page at exactly the same time. So when we're talking about rivalness, it means that at exactly the same time, it can't be enjoyed by more than one person. Now, markets are important in the context of private goods, because when goods are rival, in other words, when more than one person can't use the good at the same time, then we're going to have some way of rationing the goods. We have to have some way of distributing the goods across people. And markets help us to ration private goods. Markets do a really good job at rationing. But when goods are non-rival, in other words, when more than one person can use a product at the same time, and it doesn't really deter or diminish the enjoyment of the good at all if more people are using it, then we don't have to ration the good. Rationing isn't needed. And when rationing isn't needed, then markets are not likely to protect or produce those kinds of goods. So markets don't give us what we want. Markets end up failing. I think about it in the context of excludability. How can you keep people from using a good if they don't pay for it? If we're talking about public goods, you still have costs to pay. If more than one person can enjoy the good at the same time, then you have one person buy it and a whole bunch of people are using it. Businesses still have costs to cover. And if they're not able to make enough money providing that good, they can't cover their costs and people won't produce that good. So I've used that term public good here a couple of times. Let's define what a public good is. A public good is something that people actually want. It is a good that people desire. People like seeing fireworks, for example. But this is something that's really hard to make any money providing because the good is non-excludable. You got the fireworks going up in the air. How can you keep people from using them or enjoying them even if they don't pay for the good? That's almost impossible. And the good is non-rival in consumption. So lots of people can look at the fireworks and enjoy them, and it doesn't diminish the enjoyment of the good that other people receive. So because they're non-excludable, if the fireworks are up in the air and nobody pays, how are you going to charge somebody? You can't charge anybody, and they're non-rival in consumption, so they don't have to be rationed. And so even if you want a fireworks show, private firms are very unlikely to provide a fireworks show for you because they can't make any money at it. Somebody's got to pay the bill. And the someone who pays the bill is typically the government. They provide public goods. One of my favorite examples of a public good is National Public Radio, NPR. Now, granted, Elmo's not on NPR. He's on the television. And actually, Elmo's making money. He's got a paycheck coming in because Sesame Street is owned by HBO now. But the idea of a public good is encapsulated so perfectly in NPR, National Public Radio, because I don't have to pay anything for it. And the reason I don't have to pay anything for it is because NPR knows they can't keep me from using their good. They broadcast it out on the radio waves. They can't find my car and stop the broadcast to my car if I don't pay. Yeah, they ask me for money. They have fundraising drives all the time. And they use the terms almost of public goods. You get value from this. You should pay for this. And if you don't, you're basically a deadbeat. And I don't care what they're calling me. I still use the product for free and I still send them no money. It's a good that's non-excludable and it's non-rival in consumption. I can listen to it. You can listen to it. My parents can listen to it. Your parents can listen to it. My grandparents could listen to it. My wife's grandparents could listen to it. People all over Pittsburgh can listen to NPR. People all over the country can listen to NPR. And it doesn't make our enjoyment of the service any less. It's not like the radio signal gets weaker the more people who use it. It's a good that's non-rival in consumption and it's non-excludable. And so on the fundraising drives, even though people do know where I live, they can't charge me any money for it. Governments provide public goods. They provide things like national defense. They provide things like lighthouses. They provide things like NPR. They fund those things. But there's a lot of other things that governments provide as well that aren't pure public goods. They don't have the characteristics of being non-rival in consumption and non-excludable. Governments provide some things that are referred to as quasi-public goods. And there are two categories of quasi-public goods. One's called a common resource good. We talked a little bit about this with the commons problem. This is when you have no legal owner of a product or a service or a good. And so there's no ability to exclude people from it. There's no need to exclude people from it. But the problem, of course, is that those goods tend to be overused. So in this case, in the case of a common resource good, it's non-excludable. So you can't keep people from paying for it. There's no owner to defend the property. But it's also rival in consumption. So it can be easily depleted or ruined. This would be the case of something like fish in the ocean. It's a common pool, and so it's non-excludable, but it's certainly rival in consumption because the more people who fish, the less fish there are, and then as those stocks get depleted, people are harmed by this. It's not like a public good where the good would be non-rival in consumption, and as many people who want to use it as are out there can use it. So one type of quasi-public good is the common resource good. The other type of quasi-public good is a club good. A club good is a good that's excludable, but it's non-rival in consumption. An example of this would be satellite TV or satellite radio. So as opposed to national public radio, satellite radio is something you have to pay for, and if you don't pay for it, you don't get it. They can shut the signal off to you. But it's non-rival, so lots of people can use it without inhibiting the enjoyment of other people. These club goods are a good that, because it's excludable, the private sector can provide it. But it can be difficult, and maybe you know someone who has a Netflix subscription who shares their passcode with their friends. That makes these club goods a little bit tricky because, yes, you can exclude people, but it's non-rival in consumption, and it may be hard to exclude everybody. Now, back to the main point here, and that's with public goods. Public goods suffer from a huge problem. It's something we call the free rider problem. Free riders are the people who receive a benefit from the good and they don't pay for it. And that's clearly illustrated in public goods. One of the examples, one of the illustrations of a public good is a restaurant who wants to provide meals to people. And there have been examples of this, or at least attempts at this, where they ask people to just come in, eat at the restaurant, and then just pay whatever they feel like. It's a service that's it's intended to help people who are down on their luck, who might need a meal now and then and can't really afford to pay much. And hopefully other people who can afford will come to the restaurant and pay a little bit extra and kind of smooth things out. But that hardly ever happens. Anytime these restaurants are tried, they last for a little while, and then everybody sort of takes advantage of the situation. They free ride by not paying. Letting classmates do the work in a group project. That's another example of a free rider, where you get into a group and you're supposed to each contribute something to the project, and then maybe someone ends up doing most of the work because the other people are not contributing, knowing that there are a few people in the group who can't help but try to do all the work. Because of this free rider problem, markets tend to undersupply public goods. People aren't going to reveal their true preferences. They're not going to pay for things if they don't have to. And when they don't pay for things they don't have to, then the product ceases to exist. Let me give you a really good illustration of this. Welcome to Berry College. This is a college in Berry, Georgia. And Berry's known for, obviously, its beautiful campus. But it's also known for something called the Berry Bikes. The Berry Bike Program. Now, these aren't Berry bikes. These are bikes, you may have seen them around cities and towns, where you can go and rent out the bike. You pick it up here, you can ride it wherever, you can drop it off at another station. Well, the Berry Bike Program was sort of a precursor to this. Except the Berry Bike Program failed miserably and spectacularly because it was trying to provide a public good. There were about 15 or 20 Berry bikes that were provided to students at Berry College. And the first semester these bikes were made available, basically a note went out to the student body. It said, hey, we're providing these bikes for you to get around campus. Pick up the bike wherever you see it, drop it off wherever you need to drop it off. Here you go. Well, at the end of the first semester of the Berry Bike Program, of about 20 bikes that were made available, 11 of them were in a state of utter disrepair. 4 of them were missing entirely. And the student body president who had organized this Berry Bike Program was kind of distraught and wrote an impassioned letter to the campus community. Please don't ruin the Berry bikes. These things are here for your use, for your enjoyment. They are a service that are provided for you, and we're going to try to fix up some of these bikes over the break, but please don't mess with the bikes up. Well, the second semester of the Berry Bike Program was tried. It was ended after about 3 weeks because there were not enough bikes to actually make the program worthwhile. The bikes were just destroyed by kids using bikes that weren't their property. They were found in the river. They were found in the woods. They were found mangled by the side of the road. College kids just did what college kids are going to do. They, try to do tricks on the bike. They try to drive the bikes drunk. They do all kinds of stupid things, but there's no repercussions because the bikes don't really belong to anyone. They're a public good. They're non-rival in consumption, and they're non-excludable. Anybody can use the bikes, and nobody has to pay for them. It's a good idea in theory, but because it's a public good, it's a problem. Now, this kind of program that you see on the screen, you've got to give financial information to the company who's providing the bikes. And so if the bike is found in a state of disrepair, it's going to be your fault. It's going to be on you because you used the bike last. There's a paper trail, and we have your credit card information. So what happens to common property? Well, what happens to common property is this. It ends up on the side of the road, abused, misused, and in a state of somewhat disrepair. You see, the problem is, with public goods, there's a huge incentive to free ride. You understate the value of a public good, even though you want it. So if someone were to come to you and say, hey, do you want this? And you say, yes, I do. How much would you be willing to pay for it? And immediately we're going to be defensive about this. Why should I let you know that? Are you going to charge me my true value? Well, if you're going to charge me what I tell you, I'm going to undercut the value of what I really believe this product, this good, this service is worth to me. Because I know someone else is going to pay for it. I don't want to say it's not worth anything. I'll say it's worth something, but because someone else is going to pay, I can, you know, lowball the price. And the result, of course, is that if there's too many people who lowball the price of how much they really value something, then not as much of a good or service that people would like will be provided because there's not enough revenue to cover the costs. This can lead to a serious problem, and it's a problem that we can analyze with game theory. So let's take a look at one last game theoretic matrix that helps us to understand the incentive to free ride.
Okay, let's take a look at the game theory matrix for free riding. Let's say we have two people. We have me over here. Let's make that a little neater. And you up here. And we have two possibilities as far as strategies. We can free ride or we cannot free ride. Now, if we both free ride, we both presume that we're going to get the good, which gives us a payoff of 10, and we don't have to pay for it, which is great. If we both choose not to free ride, we still both get the good, but now we have to pay for it, so our payoffs will be less. I'll just say 5 for each of us. Now, the off diagonals help us to determine what the strategy is going to be. Let's say that I'm going to free ride and you're not going to free ride. That means I still get the good. I'm still not paying for it, so my payoff remains at 10. But now you are paying for both of us, so your payoff goes down to 2. If we're in the southwest box, then I'm the one paying because I'm not free riding down here. So I get the payoff of 2. You do free ride, you get the good, you get a payoff of 10. So if we look at the strategy options here, we can see very clearly that there is a dominant strategy for both you and for me. If I free ride, if that's my choice, then you are in a better position to also free ride. 10 as opposed to 2, or 10 as opposed to 5. In fact, it doesn't really matter what I do. Your dominant strategy is to free ride. And if we look at me, 10 is greater than 2, and 10 is greater than 5. So no matter what you do, either you free ride or don't free ride, I want that payoff of 10, and I only get that if I also free ride. So that puts us up here. And at first blush, that would seem to be the right choice. 10 and 10 is the higher joint payoff. It's better than this down here, the 5 and 5. So it looks like there's no real dilemma here. Except there is a dilemma. Because if we both free ride, how much of the good gets produced? Well, the answer is 0. There's no good being produced. And so instead of getting a payoff of 10 and 10, we both get a payoff of 0. The free rider problem essentially amounts to a prisoner's dilemma where we trick ourselves, where we think someone else will surely pay for it, but they don't. And with a 2-player free rider problem, we both end up with nothing. That's not where we would go if those were the payoffs in the box, but we think the payoffs will be 10 and 10.
Free riding is entirely rational. If you can get someone else to pay for something you want, you do it. But the downside is that it prevents the private market from producing things that people want in the quantities that they want them. When more people are involved in receiving benefits from a public good, then the free riding just gets worse and worse and worse. Because there are so many people who lowball the price. The main solution to the free riding problem then is that government, realizing that people want this product and that they can provide it, they just tax everybody. They tax everybody to eliminate the free riding problem. So if you want something and you're willing to pay for it, you may end up paying less with taxes, but you also may end up paying more, and you may end up paying for things that you don't want at all. But to eliminate the free rider problem, governments use taxes. Now, that still doesn't explain how much of a public good we should be providing. To efficiently produce a public good, we're missing something. We're missing that signal that is usually sent by the private market. So how much to produce, while it is still dependent on the relationship between marginal benefit and marginal cost, the analysis of this is going to have to change just ever so slightly. The marginal cost is still just the normal marginal cost. It's the opportunity cost in this case of using a resource to produce some other kind of good. Instead, we're going to use that resource to produce a public good. But the marginal benefit is more difficult to determine because the good is non-rival. Remember that non-rivalness of a public good poses some problems. It poses the problem that because any number of people can use this good at the same time, then it's going to be hard to specify what the marginal benefit is because we're not talking about one person anymore. We're talking about a lot of different people. So the marginal benefit of a public good needs to be thought of differently. It's not the value to a single person. So when we're looking at the marginal benefit of producing a public good, what we want to do is try to figure out what's the marginal benefit to everyone who values the public good. And we're going to add up all of that marginal benefit of the public good at a particular level or a particular output. As a result of that, we're going to end up with the combined willingness to pay, which is the social marginal benefit. Now, the way we do this is to look at individual demand curves. So we'll use a fireworks show as an example. Everyone has a demand for a public good to some extent. Maybe it's very small, maybe it's a little bit larger. The height of the demand curves for each individual at each output level tells us the marginal benefit. So what we do is we sum the vertical distances of the marginal benefits to get the social marginal benefit. So let's take a look at that.
Okay, so how do we solve for the optimal amount of a public good? Well, we'll put the quantity of the good here on the vertical axis, on the horizontal axis, and the price on the vertical axis. And we're going to draw a couple of different demand curves. So here's one demand curve. Here's another demand curve. We're going to start off with these two demand curves. And let's say we're looking at fireworks shows. Clearly there's a demand here. And because fireworks shows tend to be public goods, these are things that governments might provide. So when we want to figure out what's the actual demand for this market, or the marginal benefit for this market, what we're going to do is we're going to sum the vertical distances. So up to the blue curve, we have, let's just say 10. That's the value that person 1, and let's label this as D1, puts on one fireworks show. And if we go up to D2, then we see that at D2, this is about 15. So we're going to sum those two vertical distances, and we'll get a point on our new demand curve. Our social demand curve, or our social marginal benefit curve. So we'll go up there and put a dot at 25. And then for the second show, we see that the marginal benefit decreases some. Maybe this goes down to, say, 7. We see on the second demand curve, maybe we're at, I would say, 13. And when we sum those two things vertically, we get an amount around here at 20. So those are 2 points on our demand curve. Now the next point on our demand curve is going to occur right here, because at 3 fireworks shows, the demand curve for 1 is at 0. We go up to the next demand curve, and that marginal benefit is the market marginal benefit, so we can put a black dot right there. And if we connect these dots, our market marginal benefit has this kink in it, where basically we have this downward sloping line up here. This is part of our demand curve. And then because there's only one person demanding the good after 3 units, then the market demand curve and that D2 curve are the same. So, in order to find out what's the optimal number of fireworks shows, we need a marginal cost curve. So let's draw the marginal cost curve in, let's put it right here. Say this is our marginal cost. And that looks like it's about, we'll say 19. So what we can tell is that show 1 and show 2 are worth it, because the social marginal benefit, which is this black line, the social marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost for shows 1 and 2. But not for 3. Clearly, for the third show, the marginal cost exceeds the marginal benefit, and we wouldn't do that. But let me just ask you a question real quickly here about this graph. Can you imagine a case where we do 3 shows even if demand 1 equals 0? How would we end up doing 3 shows? And really, the only way you can justify doing 3 shows is if the marginal cost is somehow below that value. That looks like it's here, maybe about 10. So if marginal cost is less than 10, we might do that third show, or we would do that show. We could justify doing the third show, even though the blue demand curve, the first person there doesn't want it. And maybe that first person has to end up help paying for it. They may have to help pay for it, even though they don't want it.
So how do we know if we're producing efficiently based on this? Well, the efficient result occurs where marginal benefit of society equals the marginal cost. That's where the 2 lines are crossing. Now, this won't always occur, of course. Efficiency in public goods is dependent upon good information, and that can be hard to come by. We know that the private market's not going to produce public goods because of the free rider problem. Government will produce public goods, but only if they can collect enough revenue to provide that item. And identifying the proper tax or the proper size of the tax is really, really difficult. The difficulty occurs because people aren't willing to reveal their true preferences for the goods. And government can't figure that out any better than the private sector. In fact, they may do it worse. Because we don't know the precise amount of marginal benefit, then we don't know the precise amount to tax people to get to that socially optimal marginal benefit. In a private market, we figure that out because people reveal their willingness to pay. Here, people aren't paying, or at least not paying the true value, and so we don't have that ability to be as precise as the private market in terms of efficiency. Now, the other type of market failure I want to cover today is something we call an externality. Externalities are the costs or benefits of a market activity that affect a third party. The third party are people who are not part of the market transaction, the formal market transaction. They're not the buyers and the sellers in the market, they're somebody else. Externalities often arise because of a lack of clearly defined property rights, which gives rise to one of the more widely known theorems in economics, which we'll get to a little bit later. When we're talking about externalities, we're talking about, for instance, trying to identify who the third parties are and what amount of harm or benefit are they receiving. Probably the easiest way to identify this, or to the most simple of all examples, is pollution. So the problem with property rights and externalities in the case of pollution is who owns the air and who owns the water and who owns the stuff that's getting polluted. If we knew who owned those things, or if somebody did own those things, then we could clearly establish a scenario where the pollution is reduced to the optimal amount. And again, I'll show you how that works into our mystery theorem here in a little bit. So how do externalities differ from public goods? I think that's an important thing to start off, to talk about here. The key difference is that there are external effects. There are those third parties. These side effects are unintended, entirely unintended. The result of the activity, of the market activity, is that there are these externalities that exist, these side effects that come about. And these side effects, again, impact third parties. I mean, you have to understand here, when we're talking about the externalities, people don't want to deal with the externalities. It's not like some evil factory owner is out there thinking how great it is to pollute the world, because they'll be impacted by that too. What people do like is reducing the costs of an activity. Think about driving a car. It emits a lot of pollution. If you were serious about protecting the environment, you would stop driving your car. But most people aren't that serious, because the car provides benefits to them, even though it imposes costs on them and on third parties. So let's take a look at that third party problem. When externalities are created, there are costs or benefits to the individuals in the market transaction. And those costs and benefits diverge from the social cost or benefit. So when we're talking about externalities, we're dealing with two sets of costs or two sets of benefits, one to the private part of the transaction and one to the private plus the rest of society, the social part of the transaction. If someone only sees the internal part or the private part, in the case of costs, for example, if they only are worried about the costs that are imposed upon themselves, then they're going to produce more because they don't bear the true cost of the activity. If the person producing a good or service only sees the internal benefit or the private benefit, then they will produce too little from society's point of view, because there are benefits that go beyond just what happens to the private citizen. But they're not being compensated for those benefits, for the benefits that they create, so the private actor isn't going to produce as much. It's this third party again. These third parties, they're always kind of lurking about. The third party is the entity that experiences the costs and benefits that go beyond the normal market transaction. And it's because of the third parties that we have externalities. Now, externalities often result in inefficient outcomes, just like public goods. What we're going to see is that the demand and the supply only show the benefits and costs to the participant in the market, and they don't account for what happens to the third party. So let's take a look here. When we have externalities, we have internal costs. These are the costs, again, of the activity that are paid by an individual engaging in the activity. The external costs are the costs that are paid for by somebody else, somebody not directly involved with the market activity, with the transaction that's taking place. Again, we can think about pollution. So there's somebody who lives in a town downstream from a factory. There's a factory, it's producing things, it's buying and selling inputs, it's producing a product that's then sold to consumers. The factory pays the costs of production that are directly relevant to its productions. But if they start dumping toxic waste into the river and that toxic river water comes downstream to this person in this little town downstream, and now that person can't use the river for anything, whether it's drinking, swimming, fishing, boating, because the river is polluted, well, now they're the third party, not directly impacted by the market activity, but harmed by what's going on as a result of the activity. The social costs are the sum of the internal and the external costs. So social costs, if there are any external costs at all, will be higher than the private internal costs of a transaction. All right, well, let's break this down a little bit more into the two different types of externalities. One type of externality, the one that's most commonly thought of when we think about externalities, are the negative externalities. These are the costs that are experienced by third parties. When we have negative externalities, too much of the good is being produced because the true costs of production are not accounted for. And examples of this include pretty much any type of pollution you want to think of, spam email, secondhand smoke, those kinds of things. So here's a picture of Pittsburgh back in the day, actually back in the daytime, when the city got its identity as a very dirty, polluted city. This is actually a street in Pittsburgh in the, I think this is the 1950s. In the middle of the day, when the soot and the smog and the pollution from the mills was just so thick and dense, the town had to keep the street lights on. And you see, it almost looks like it's snowing, like there's something on this car that is piling up. Well, that's the soot, that's the cinder ash coming from the steel mills. This is a clear example of a negative externality because not everybody in Pittsburgh was involved with making steel, and they still had to bear the costs of the activity. Let's see if you can spot the externality in this picture. This is the outside of the library, of course. Do you see the externality? There it is. The externality is this trash that's thrown here, this mask that somebody didn't want to use anymore. And there it is, thrown on the ground. That's the externality. Externalities occur in a lot of different ways. Negative externalities tend to be the ones that are a little bit easier to identify. So let's take a look at the negative externality model to see if we can understand why the output that is produced is greater than it should be.
So what does the graph look like when we are trying to deal with negative externalities? Well, it looks like a market graph for the most part. We have quantity, we have price here. We have a demand curve and a supply curve, but we're going to label them just a little bit differently than we're used to. This is our demand curve, but this also is the marginal benefit. And because we're dealing with this particular market, this is the private marginal benefit. This is what happens. This is the demand side of the market and just the private demand side. The supply curve looks like this, but as we know, the supply curve is also the marginal cost curve. And the supply curve, the marginal cost curve in this case, is the private or the internal marginal cost. So this is just basically what happens in the market. We find where those two lines intersect, we have our price, and we have our quantity. The price and quantity are the market equilibrium. So this is the market equilibrium. But we want to include the social costs here as well because we're looking at externalities. So if we include the additional costs of production that are imposed on the third party, we have this second supply or marginal cost curve that represents the social marginal cost. This is the private costs plus the external costs. So remember, this is private plus external costs. This is where society truly would like to see this market. So instead of having this quantity here, which is the private quantity or the market quantity, we have the social quantity. That's what markets. What society would truly like to see. This is not the market equilibrium, but this is what we call the social optimum right here. Now, the problem, of course, with this for the market is that when we're at this market equilibrium, society is experiencing a deadweight loss that is the equivalent of this yellow triangle here. So we have the deadweight loss because we're overproducing. This quantity private, this is representing the overproduction of the good that generates these external costs. And there's a deadweight loss that results. Now notice, the social optimum isn't a production of zero, but it's a production that's less than what the market equilibrium would generate. As we're going to see, what we want government to do is to try to figure out a way to internalize the externality so that we can shift this curve to the left, shift that supply curve. So internalizing the externality means that we shift the cost curve and basically force the creators of the externality to pay the true cost of production. So policy should be designed to move that private marginal cost curve to the left.
The other type of externality, of course, is a positive externality. This is the benefits that are accruing to third parties. So somebody's out there benefiting from the activities of somebody else. So there's this market activity going on over here, and this third party kind of walks on by and receives some benefit from the activity of the market. The problem with that is that there's not enough of this activity that's going to take place because this third party doesn't pay for the benefit. So there's no financial incentive to continue the activity or continue as much of the activity. Some of the examples that we would see here of positive externalities would be things like education or vaccinations or music, arts. Those kinds of things can provide benefits to people, but they don't always have to pay for them. Like these guys. These are a couple of buskers in New York City. I took this picture a couple of years ago. These guys were setting up to play music, and they were really, really good. You see, there's a little basket sort of in front of the guys there. That's where you could throw your money if you like their busking. The problem, of course, is they're playing music. People walk by, they enjoy the music, they benefit from it, but there's no reason to put money in the basket. They're providing a positive externality to be sure, but they're also providing a public good, and so there's no incentive to pay for this. And so we don't get as much of this really great music as we ought because these guys aren't benefiting financially. They can't quit their jobs and just be buskers full time because the money's not good enough. Now, before we look at the model for the positive externality, let's think about positive externalities just in a little bit more depth here. Think about what's going to happen when there's a COVID vaccine. Is it worth it to you to get the vaccination when you compare the costs and the benefits? For a lot of people, the answer will be yes, of course it will be worth it. For a lot of other people, they'll say no, it's not worth it. But maybe it would be worth it if instead of yourself, you thought of the benefits that would be granted to the third parties as well. So yeah, surely there's a cost to getting the vaccination. There's a monetary cost, there's a time cost, there's a cost that you might have a negative reaction, there's a cost that you might get sick for a short period of time. But the benefits to you over the long haul will be that, hey, I'm vaccinated against COVID. This is fantastic. And the benefits to people who aren't you is that you are no longer a spreader of COVID. That's a significant benefit. And if you included that benefit in your calculation, maybe you would get more, you'd be more prone to be vaccinated against COVID, and so would more other people. So let's take a look at the positive externality model, so we can try to understand the benefits that are created, the benefits that are generated through vaccinations and other kinds of activities that provide positive externalities.
The graph for the positive externality looks a lot like the one for the negative externality, with one notable change. We're going to have our supply curve, and this is the private marginal cost. So that's our supply curve. And here's our demand curve, and this demand curve is the private marginal benefit. And where the two lines cross, we have our market equilibrium. And that gives us our market quantity. We'll call this the private quantity, just the market quantity. But because this activity generates a positive externality, what society would like to see is the demand curve be out here. This is where we want the marginal benefit. This is where we want the market to be. This is the social marginal benefit. So what society would prefer would actually be here at a higher output. So if we don't somehow account for this positive externality, we're going to have underproduction. That underproduction occurs because the true benefits to society are not being captured. Now, like we saw with the negative externality, there was a deadweight loss of overproduction. Well, in this case, we have a deadweight loss from underproduction. And so that's this triangle here. So if we can shift that demand curve to the right using policy, whether through some sort of subsidization of the activity, so we get more, we help people to pay for this activity, or through whatever policy we use, we want to shift that curve from the marginal benefit private curve, this one here, out to the right to the marginal benefit social curve. And if we do that, we can eliminate this deadweight loss. And that's the goal of policy, is we want to increase production and eliminate the deadweight loss so that we are more in line with the social optimum.
So how do we correct for externalities? Well, when we correct for those externalities, what we're trying to do is internalize the externality. In other words, make the people who are responsible for the externality or who benefit from the activity pay for the externality. So the individual involved in the account or the activity here is going to take account for the social costs. So if we can get the producer of the costs to pay for the costs, then that's what shifts that cost curve that we just saw. Or if we can get people to be paid for the benefits, then we see that shift in the marginal benefit curve or the demand curve. Attempts to bring the market outcome, correcting for the externality, is an attempt to bring the market outcome in line with the social outcome, with the social optimum, what people truly want. We want to try to bring the market into alignment with what society views to be the correct quantity and price. So if we didn't have externalities, what would the world look like? That's what we're trying to do when we correct for those externalities. Now, for negative externalities, what we want to do is force the individual to pay for the external costs. So we could tax production, we could regulate production, we could do something that's going to shift the supply curve to the left. Sort of the nuclear option would be to just shut down production altogether, force them to close. whatever the tool used to internalize the negative externality, what you're doing is reducing output. Theoretically, one of the ways that that's done is through taxation, specifically with something called a Pigouvian tax. With the Pigouvian tax, what we're doing is we are taxing the producer to provide an incentive to change behavior. Again, we're internalizing the cost so that the full cost is borne by the producer of the externality. We're shifting the marginal cost curve to match that of societies. We've already seen this. But what makes this specifically a Pigouvian tax is that the tax perfectly brings into alignment the social and private cost curves. The Pigouvian tax, you can think of the Pigouvian tax, named after R.C. Pigou, the economist. What's theoretical about this tax is that it is perfect. It's a tax that's levied that perfectly brings these two things into alignment. Another way to put this would be to say that the tax exactly equals the value of the externality imposed. Now, this is incredibly theoretical because it's incredibly unlikely that there will be a perfect tax to accomplish this objective. But the Pigouvian tax, the advantage of the Pigouvian tax is that it eliminates any inefficiencies that would come through using any other kind of tax. So there's not too much produced, there's not too little produced, we're not scaring off producers that should be involved in the market, and we're not allowing producers to get away with not paying the costs of production. When it comes to correcting for externalities on the positive side, we want to help people realize the external benefits. So what we can do is help to finance or subsidize the production and the consumption of the goods that are generating those positive externalities. We could have, for example, laws that require consumption, that require people to be vaccinated, that require people to go to school because of the positive value, the positive benefits that are occurring from the provision of these things. Overall, of course, we're trying to increase consumption. And that's what we see when that marginal benefit curve shifts to the right, or that demand curve shifts to the right. So in our graph, we see that curve shifting to the right, and that's how the model accounts for the internalizing of the positive externality. So let's just summarize the externalities here as we've seen them. The negative externalities are costs borne by third parties, where the positive externalities are benefits received by third parties. We can see clear illustrations of negative externalities in oil refining and traffic congestion and airports. Different kinds of pollution are probably the clearest illustration of negative externalities. Positive externalities are things like flu shots or a COVID shot. Education, because that allows citizens to be more productive, to make better decisions, to produce things that are going to go out and benefit third parties. Or the restoring of historic buildings, where people can enjoy the historic details, can enjoy the architecture. I didn't have any role in restoring the building, but I still get that benefit. I think about this in terms of somebody's garden. If it's a beautiful garden, you walk by it at night in your neighborhood and you say, wow, that's awesome. You had no role in providing it, but it is still a benefit to you to have it there. In terms of corrective measures on the negative side, we can tax people, we can charge them fees, we can regulate their activity. On the positive side, we can subsidize those goods or simply have government provide them. Now, I don't want to leave all of this discussion of market failures with the belief that governments can always and easily fix market failures. Governments sometimes get it right. Sometimes they do things and provide things that markets don't do. And governments can sometimes increase efficiency by providing public goods and dealing with externalities. However, the government's incentives to do these things are not always, they're not the same as private sector companies because there's no profit motive. There's a political motive often, but it's not a profit motive, and so that alters your incentives. So the government provision may not be efficient. And when it's actually less efficient than the market setup, we have what's called a government failure. This is when government intervenes in the markets and make things worse. So what we can do is we can compare the inefficiency of a market failure to the inefficiencies of government failures and try to choose the lesser of two evils. All right, that brings us to the last point that I want to make here, and that is fixing market failures with property rights. So this kind of brings us back to where we started when we were talking about property rights. Probably the most referenced, or possibly the most referenced research paper ever in the history of economics is a paper written by this guy, Ronald Coase. It's the results of that paper have become known as the Coase theorem, and the Coase theorem focuses on fixing market failures. Basically, what Coase said was that if you assign property rights, that's really important to help deal with market failures. But who you assign the property right to doesn't really matter as long as a property right exists. Coase says that in the absence of transaction costs, in other words, in the absence of negotiation costs, then the private costs for both parties in a transaction will equal the social costs. And therefore, the externalities will automatically be internalized. And what will result is that the socially efficient outcome will be reached, regardless of how the property rights are initially assigned. That's the basics of the Coase theorem. But what does that really mean? Let me break that down just a little bit for you. What the Coase theorem is saying is that as long as the rights are clearly defined, as long as we know who has the property right, and that property right is enforced, bargaining between the parties can ensure an efficient outcome. Let's take a look at an example here. Let's say we have two businesses that are side by side. One is a candy maker and one is a doctor's office. The candy maker's business is noisy. The doctor's office needs quiet to take care of his patients. Who has the right then to the sound, to the noise or the quiet? And how does that lead us to an efficient outcome? We're going to say that the candy maker values their business at $100 and the doctor values their business at $200. If the doctor gets the property right, he can demand that the candy maker quits and society gains $200 in value. But what happens if the candy maker gets the right? We know that the value of the candy maker's business is less than that of the doctor's. The candy maker only gets $100 of value and the doctor goes away. Well, if the candy maker is given the right and the transaction costs are minimal, then the doctor could just pay the candy maker to go away. It could pay them $150 to stop. The doctor still has the benefit of $50, which is preferred to losing the business. Society still has the $200 business, the doctor business, that it would prefer because of the higher value. So what we see here is that it doesn't matter to society who has the property right as long as one is assigned. If it's assigned to the doctor, then great. If it's assigned to the candy maker, the doctor and the candy maker can negotiate. The doctor can pay off the candy maker to stop, and society still gets the higher valued business. So no matter who has the property right, we still see that society gets $200, the candy maker goes out of business, and the doctor is still in business. Of course, you may be identifying one of the significant problems for the Coase theorem here. It's not a problem for the Coase theorem, it's just a reality. While society is made equally well off, the two parties are not made equally well off here. It matters to the doctor and the candy maker who gets the right. For the doctor, they want the right for themselves because now they don't have to pay off the candy maker. The candy maker wants the right because, okay, yes, I'm going out of business, but at least I'm getting paid off to go out of business. These are what are called the distributional effects. So I hate to use this term, but I could say at the macro level, at the society level, everything is the same no matter who has the property right. But at the micro level, it matters tremendously. Now, there is one other problem, of course, with the Coase theorem, and you may have identified this, and that is that the transaction costs have to be very, very low. If the doctor has to pay off, say, 3 candy makers, now there are negotiations, and one candy maker might hold out to get paid more than the others. That's a problem for the Coase theorem. In the real world, do we really have low transaction costs? Maybe in some cases, maybe in a small town, but in a lot of cases, that's not true. There are significant transaction costs.